Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Today's Bright Blue TV is on China, friend or foe. China is set to become the world's next superpower. Should the UK celebrate, or should we be afraid? Today on Bright Blue TV, we will unpack China's relationship with the United Kingdom, especially in light of the recently released Integrated Review, which places China as a systematic competitor rather than an acute and direct threat. I'm Nikita Malik, Deputy Director of Bright Blue, and I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by three fantastic panelists. The founder and chief executive of Hong Kong Watch, Benedict Rogers, the broadcast editor and China reporter for The Spectator, Cindy Yu, and the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary China Group, Richard Graham, MP. Please do submit your questions to Slido today under the hashtag BrightBlueTV. So let's get started. Benedict, I'll start with you. In January, you wrote that the British government should conduct a wholesale and thorough review of UK-China policy, leading to a recalibration and a reset in the UK of its strategy. How do you think the UK has handled trade deals with countries that have been convicted of genocide in the past? And do you think the focus has been more on trade than on human rights?
Well, thank you, Nikita. It's a pleasure to be with you and great to be with Richard and Cindy on this important topic. I think to answer your question very directly, one of the problems that we have is that there is no mechanism for determining satisfactorily genocide. And that's one of the reasons why a number of parliamentarians put forward the genocide amendment to the trade bill to try to create that mechanism. Because the government's position is that, unlike some other governments, that genocide should be determined by a court of law. But the reality is, particularly when it comes to China, the international courts are hamstrung. They can't make that determination because of China's veto power, and our own domestic courts can't either. And so, yes, I think in the past, we have prioritized trade over human rights. And I think when it comes to genocide, we really need to find a way to have a mechanism to determine it and then determine our policy as a result. Of course, it always has to be a balance. No one's saying we shouldn't trade, but I think we should look very carefully at our priorities when it comes to human rights issues that are as serious as the level of genocide.
So let me unpack that a little further. Do you think that the United Kingdom has gone far enough now? Has it made enough progress now with some of the changes that have been enacted recently, or do you think there's more to go in kind of the trade that we're doing with China in particular?
Well, I really welcome the steps that Dominic Raab has taken, particularly with regard to the situation in Xinjiang. But I certainly think there's more that could be done. I think, for example, we might come on to Magnitsky sanctions, but I think it's surprising that even though the government has sanctioned some officials responsible for the atrocities against the Uyghurs, the party secretary of Xinjiang, who of course was previously the party secretary in Tibet, who's the architect of the acceleration of oppression in Xinjiang, is not on the sanctions list. So I think there's more that could be done there. I think there's more that could be done in terms of diversifying our trading relationships around the world, not putting so much emphasis on the relationship with China, and particularly ensuring that slave labor is not used in supply chains. So welcome steps so far, but definitely more to do.
Okay. Cindy, I'll turn to you. You've written about a more nuanced China, and you've said that it's because it's home to 1.5 billion people. China shouldn't be depicted as a new enemy. It's more nuanced than that. But picking up on what Benedict said, how best do you think the United Kingdom and other Western actors should then engage with China, especially given its poor record on human rights?
So yes, I have written that China is not an enemy in the past, but I also don't think China is necessarily a friend. I think that when we're asking for nuance, we need to realize that in some areas we should cooperate with China, and in some we need to set out our red lines. And I know that's a really boring middle of the road answer, but I think we just need to be clearer about what our red lines are. Now, for Benedict and people who work in human rights abuses are the red line, and that is definitely very important. But when you're looking at the foreign policy of an entire country dealing with an entire other country, there are more things that have to come into bearing as well. And so, there's all sorts of small print that we need to be talking about. I don't think that human rights can be the only lodestar to determine our foreign policy with other countries. I'm not saying that Benedict was saying that either, but if we did do that, that would rule out a lot of countries that we would be doing business with and welcoming their people with, not least our allies like Saudi Arabia around the world. So we have to think about what are our red lines when it comes to China. For one, we might say that key infrastructure is something that we need to be careful of. But even within that, I think there are small prints to be sought out. As in, are we talking about state-owned enterprises funding it, or are we talking about private enterprises? Because there is a difference there, and often we just label everything under the banner of Chinese investment, which really isn't good enough. But then there's other things like when we're talking about campus freedom. Is it really such a problem to have Chinese students in the UK? I don't think so. And yes, you might say that, their families might be held hostage by the CCP and all this sort of stuff, but we need to see evidence of that. We need to see evidence that having a large number of Chinese students on our campuses is actually a threat to freedom of speech. And I haven't seen that. So in all of these areas, we need to set out our red lines, whether it's key infrastructure and no more, or we need to say actually people-to-people relationships we should still allow. That's the sort of thing that Britain needs to think about. And I actually think that the integrated review recently was quite good at doing that, because let's be clear, China has not poisoned anyone on British soil, unlike the Russians. So the way that it distinguishes the threat from China and the threat from Russia in the integrated review, I think was pretty good, very mature. And we need to just think about the ways in which this country that represents a fifth of the world's population and all the different complexities that it involves, and how that relates to what we want out of this relationship.
I agree with that, and I'd love to unpack it a little bit more when we get to questions about the Chinese threat in the UK, especially around statements like what was made recently by the head of MI5, that China is the greatest threat to the UK. I think it would be interesting to get to that in a little bit, and how helpful language like that is, perhaps, or unhelpful. But I'll jump to you, Richard. You've talked about the UK's strategic partnership with China, which is particularly important at a time when China is exporting capital and growing its global footprint. So how can we cooperate with China on global issues like climate change ahead of big events this year, like COP26, while at the same time being robust in confronting violations from China? Sorry, I think you're on mute. Sorry, Richard.
Look, I think this is a really interesting discussion. The key thing is that we have to deal with the world as it is while working for the world that we want. And the reality is that China is our third largest bilateral trading partner, over $90 billion a year, and a really important partner for us as a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council in dealing with some of these huge global challenges, whether they're health, environment, and climate change. So we have to engage. There is no option. To be in a situation where we don't have regular ministerial and government-to-government dialogue is not a good place to be in. So that, I think, is the first point. The second point is that we can combine, as we always have to with every large country in the world, a nuanced and balanced relationship that enables us both to compete, to cooperate, and to call out when need be. And that's where we need to be, and that's where we can be. But it does require parliamentarians in particular to exercise more nuance in their debates on China. It cannot be purely a human rights discussion. And to have had 11 debates on Xinjiang and the issues of the Uyghurs, which I know probably better than any other parliamentarian, having spent quite a lot of time in Xinjiang, is out of all proportion to the scope and importance of the relationship that encompasses security, cyber, and all these other issues that I've touched on. That is the key thing, is getting the right balance.
Mm-hmm. So talking about cooperation, Benedict, earlier you mentioned Magnitsky type sanctions, which have been employed by Russian individuals and are increasingly being employed against Chinese individuals who are responsible for human rights violations. Is this a case of too little, too late, or is it going to be effective in what we needed to do?
Well, thank you. Just before I answer that question, let me just say that I think the differences between Cindy and Richard and myself are actually very small. I think there's a lot of common ground between us, and I certainly would agree that human rights, as profoundly serious as they are certainly not the only consideration in the relationship. And national security, I think, is a major issue. I think that, of course, trade is also an issue. And I think that the question of Chinese, and let me also say, and I'll probably say this at the end, I think we really need to make a distinction between China and the Chinese Communist Party regime. And what I'm talking about is the Chinese Communist Party regime. I'm a friend of China, the people of China, but I'm a critic of the regime, and that's what we should focus on. But to come to your question, yes, I think it is too little, too late. Certainly, they were a long time coming, and there was a lot of calls for Magnitsky sanctions for some time. And as I said earlier, it is significant that the party secretary is not on the sanctions list, and I think he should be. But I think we should also be looking at wider sanctions, not against China or Chinese companies as a whole. Of course, we need to continue to trade with China, but we should be looking at certain state-owned enterprises that are complicit with the atrocities in Xinjiang, enterprises that are closely linked to the People's Liberation Army and therefore pose a security risk, and certain sectors related to all of that. So I think there's more to be done in this area, but the steps that have been taken are certainly a step forward from where we were some years ago.
And Richard, I mean, going back to kind of trade and supply chains, there's been a lot of talk from the United States, for example, from the Biden administration on reviewing these supply chains to reduce dependence on China. But from the UK, can we tackle these kind of supply chain vulnerabilities without agitating the existing trade relations we have with important partners like China? Should we be talking about that or enacting it?
Thanks, Nikita. There was a sort of, incredible interruption while you were speaking, indeed half of Ben's thing. So somebody's determined that I can't hear everything that's being said here, that the echo is coming back again. So I'm so sorry. Can you bear to repeat the crude, simple bit of the query?
Sure. How helpful do you think reviews of supply chains are?
Okay, supply chains. Yeah, look, I think there are two things that have been rather overstated recently, I think. The first is the sort of how Beijing bought Britain type headline in last week's Sunday Times, which includes all of Li Ka-shing's investment here. That is not Beijing buying Britain, it's Li Ka-shing diversifying his investment from a huge portfolio. The second one that's been rather over-exaggerated is this sort of phrase, dependence on China. We're not dependent on China, we're not dependent on any other country in the world, but it is really important to stress that the UK, and the philosophy was set by Adam Smith, with the Wealth of Nations 300 years ago, the UK benefits from a world that believes in free trade. We are largely a services-driven economy, and so we benefit from being able to supply this expertise all around the world with markets as open as possible. So growing protectionism from the US or from us or from anyone else is not in our own self-interest. That's really important to stress. And then thirdly, in terms of supply chains, I think what the pandemic has shown everybody is that you do need to have diversity. You can't have all your eggs in one basket, whatever they are, whether they're semiconductor chips or anything else. And so that's a business, a sectoral, and to some extent a government where the supply chain is by the government or its proxy, the NHS. But this sort of idea that we're dependent on China is I believe, wholly inaccurate. And it is very much up to individual businesses to make sure they've got the robustness of their supply chain. So that if one particular company or one particular country becomes inaccessible through whatever reasons, they're not suddenly scuppered. But this is not a China unique issue. This is to do with supply chains in all sorts of different ways. But the single most important thing is that the UK has to remain an open champion of global free trade. That's what Global Britain is about. That's what our manifesto is about. That's why the Trade Secretary is signing up deals left, right, and centre as fast as she can. And China is a part of that. We cannot suddenly become closed to Chinese investment and trade. What we can do is discriminate on grounds of national security interest in exactly the same way that they do, while working to get greater access for markets for our businesses over there in the same way that they have them here. So that's how I see this. It's not a sort of, are you pro or anti-China? It's about what are you going to do that is in the British national interest? And that means this balanced and nuanced approach.
Thank you. Cindy, I'd like to bring you in just to firstly ask, do you think this narrative on the dependence on China is overblown? And secondly, this idea around national security interests being a key component of this. There's of course been a lot of talk about Huawei and Huawei's presence in the United States and in the United Kingdom as kind of retracting from deals on Huawei and reducing their presence here. Do you feel those are also overblown, or are those particular aspects that we should be examining more closely for the sake of our national security?
Yeah, so on the first point for dependence, I think one example, I mentioned earlier is the role of Chinese students in the UK. Now, there's been a lot of conversations recently about our academic sector's dependence on China and the Chinese market. Richard mentioned those Sunday Times headlines, and there have been quite a few paper headlines about how the academic sector is enthralled to the Chinese market. Now, it is dependent on Chinese students, and Chinese students form the biggest group of international students in the UK. But at the same time, is that dependence on the Chinese communist regime? So this is the kind of nuance that we need to be distinguishing. Does that dependence matter politically when we haven't seen evidence of the party stopping students or using students as a pawn in the sort of geopolitical conflict? And people have cited, for example, these wolf warrior diplomats saying, we're encouraging students not to go to Australia because of increased racism, blah, 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 blah. But actually, wolf warrior diplomats can say whatever they want. People in China do whatever, if they want to send their children abroad to study because there's an increasing middle class with increasing autonomy and the financial means to do so, they will do that. And, one day, perhaps the embassy will stop signing student visas for people going abroad, but that hasn't happened yet. So when we're talking about dependence in something like the academic sector, just as one example, we need to really think about what does that actually mean? Are we worrying about things that haven't come to pass yet and that we don't have good evidence to show that it will come to pass? And on a Huawei point, I think that we need to understand greater detail about Huawei as a company. Huawei, since its inception, has actually tried to keep an arm's length from the Chinese government because it has benefited from that greater autonomy until recent years, at least, that ZTE and other competitors haven't had. Those were the companies that were closer to the Chinese government. Huawei actually, its CEO has actually always tried to be arm's length because it didn't want to be seen as part of a government apparatus. Now, that's not helped by wolf warrior diplomats, criticizing Western governments for not using Huawei equipment, and we have to bear that in mind, and who their audience are as well. But I can understand why the Huawei ban happened, especially after America, brought in protectionist measures about where it can source its semiconductors from, because at that stage, that really does change in a qualitative way the sort of equipment that Huawei can supply. So I can understand why that eventually happened. I just want to make one other point on national security and Benedict's point about how many people are not against the Chinese people, but against the Chinese communist regime. When we're talking about things like links to the PLA, we have to be clear what we're talking about here. Because what we've seen in America especially is a greater skepticism of Chinese ethnic scientists in STEM subjects, especially for their universities that they attended when they were in China. Now, the way that China works is that there was no private sector until the 80s. So if you were of a certain generation growing up in China, studying STEM subjects, your university would have been affiliated to the government and to the PLA, especially if you were doing that kind of technology, because that's the way China was until the 80s, and even now. So when we're talking about links to the PLA, we have to be careful. What are those scientists' links to the PLA really talking about? Is it just that they have had certain projects funded by them when they were in a younger stage and they've lived in America for the last, 2-3 decades? Or is it that actually they're still going back to China, they're still, there's a smoking gun about IP theft or anything like that? And I have to say that the state of conversation in America at the moment is very concerning, that anyone who has a Chinese-looking face, a Chinese-looking name, studied in China, links to the Chinese government, links to the PLA are being, tarred with the same brush. We need to really granularly look at what that actually means.
Those are very good points. Thank you. I'm going to open up to questions from the audience now, and I'd recommend anyone who's watching to please submit your questions to Slido using the hashtag #BrightBlueTV. So we have a question here. Perhaps dependent on China is too strong a word, but should we be concerned about the leverage China has over trade, investment, academia, etc.? Benedict, I'll take your thoughts first.
Yeah, well, in response to that question, and just in response to Cindy's last points, many of which I agree with, I 100% agree that we should be incredibly careful about not targeting or penalizing or discriminating against students or scholars simply because they're Chinese. And there is an alarming rise in anti-Chinese, indeed anti-East Asian and Southeast Asian racism in this country, in the US and elsewhere, and we need to really counter that. But I think we should be concerned. For example, the Civitas report recently which showed that over half of the Russell Group universities in this country have been engaged in direct research projects that have been with institutions linked to the People's Liberation Army, involving potentially research that goes into development of weaponry, of weapons of mass destruction, of institutions that the Australian Strategic Policy Institute has described as very high risk institutions. So we certainly should, to use a famous phrase, we should seek truth from facts, and we should distinguish between Chinese people and entities that are linked to the party or the army. But we should be looking very carefully at those national security threats, whether it's in academia or in certain sectors of our critical national infrastructure.
We have another question, which I'll direct to Richard and Cindy. How can the UK manage to have a constructive relationship with China while China pursues a wolf warrior style of diplomacy? Cindy, I can see you smiling, so perhaps you'd like to go first, followed by Richard.
It's a very good question. And, I smiled because China does not make it easy in a lot of instances. We recently, things that have happened are sanctions, for example, against a wide cross-party range of European politicians and academics. There's all this belligerent rhetoric coming from within Beijing and unfortunately on Twitter in English language. And it's incredibly counterproductive from the perspective of bilateral relations. But I guess the best thing we can say is that we have to be careful when citing these diplomats and thinking about how effective and important their rhetoric actually is. I think a lot of Chinese people will not feel represented by their belligerents. I've had conversations with people who say, actually, Zhao Lijian is an absolute idiot. So, that's one thing to be said. And then the other thing to be said is just thinking about who their audience are. A lot of it is to, show, how many Twitter likes that you get. Surprisingly, these KPIs that they then report up the rankings. But you'll see that actually the most senior Chinese diplomats have refrained from this sort of language. So we are seeing it from foreign ministry spokespeople who are not ambassadors themselves. Cui Tiankai, the ambassador to America himself, disputed this conspiracy theory that came lower down the rungs about the coronavirus coming from America. So we need to distinguish these things and not just say Chinese government says this. And, you know, it is tough to work with a China that's becoming more nationalistic, but there are also voices within China that are, you know, doves about the West, and we need to not be reacting to fire with fire, because that will just bolster the hawks within China as well. And so we need to find the people who will be happy to cooperate within China. We need to distinguish between the different types of CCP politicians and the schools of thought that they represent, and move forward from there, really.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Nikki, would you like me to come in on this? Look, I think there are a number of really interesting strands here. I think one of them is actually about us, not so much about China. One of the striking features at the moment is the deterioration in the lack of self-confidence in the West, the US, the UK, and democracy as a whole. Our sort of increasing paranoia that suddenly the world is going to be taken over by China. And we've got to have a great deal more self-confidence in ourselves than that. I mean, look at how we have handled, for example, the whole vaccine program. We know that the Chinese vaccine has not got remotely the same impact and success rate as the ones developed in the West. And that's one example of what can happen in a free world where intellectual curiosity and the complete freedom to research is absolutely open and encouraged. There is no sort of top-down directive about what can be said and what can't be. So all of these things should give us great confidence in our systems without needing to feel superior in any way. China has a different system, it's chosen a different path, it's got a different history, a different culture, rather different values. They're much more concerned with stability and chaos, which is the story of China in the sort of 200 years before the Communist Party. We're much more interested in freedoms and human rights. So these things are very different, and we have to learn to understand them and where they're coming from, just as much as they have put huge effort into learning all about us. And within that context, I think it's incredibly important that we focus on how we can be even better than we are. What more innovation and technology can we bring to the party? How can we continue to make the UK relevant and at the leading edge of things, so that we don't have to spend our time worrying about what is going on elsewhere? Of course, there are security issues. Of course, China's espionage is huge. I mean, that shouldn't be any surprise at all. Of course, the Communist Party is desperately sensitive to any criticism and will behave in these rather blundering, clumsy, old-fashioned ways when it gets into sort of diplomatic tips. But those of us who've spent the time and the effort to live in China, learn the language and understand China, we know all that. There's no surprise in any of that. There should be no surprise for the government in that. What we have done, which is really good, is to beef up our China expertise, more people in the China Department of the Foreign Office, more people in different departments, greater understanding, so that we as a nation approach this whole relationship in a much broader way, recognizing that you've basically got 1 billion people over in China who want, like us, to be able to grow up safely, study, fall in love, have children, get a good job, own your own property, and live a happy life. These things are fundamentally what everybody around the world wants to do. And we mustn't allow our perceptions and our paranoia to obscure us from this fundamental underlying truth.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. So to wrap up, I'd like to go back to the key question, which was China, friend or foe, and ask each of our panelists just to quickly comment on your thoughts on that. So Benedict, is China friend, foe, or something else completely? Would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you. This has been a great discussion. Two quick points. The first, which I made earlier, but I think it's important to reiterate, is that China as a country and as a people can and is and should be a friend, and we should be a friend to them. And I've spent most of my adult life, like Richard, in and around China. First went to China when I was 18 to teach English in Qingdao, the place of the best beer in China. That wasn't why I went, but it was a nice discovery once I was there. And so the question should be the Chinese Communist Party regime. Is it a friend or foe of us and indeed of the Chinese people? Because my motivation in speaking out for human rights is because I want the Chinese people to have exactly the things that Richard just outlined and to not live in fear for making a comment on the internet or going to a place of worship or whatever it might be. So that's the first point, is China can be a friend. Chinese Communist Party is certainly a challenge. And my second point is that I don't think it's for us to say that the CCP regime is a foe. I think the CCP regime itself has already declared itself, in a sense, ideologically and in terms of values, a foe. If you look at any of Xi Jinping's speeches, going back to his first speech to the Politburo in 2013, he declared very clearly that the regime must concentrate its efforts on building a socialism that is superior to capitalism and laying the foundations for a future where we will win the initiative and have the dominant position. So that is Xi Jinping's declared goal. If you look at key documents that someone like Charles Parton, who I recommend really reading his excellent research papers on the CCP, if you look at key documents that he's highlighted, like the famous document number 9, great creative title, in 2013, that outlines the party's absolute total opposition to all our values: democracy, independent journalism, the rule of law. That's reiterated in another document number 30 a year later, about the teaching of liberal values in universities. So there clearly is a clash of values. And if you look at the regime's increasing behavior on the world stage, it is a regime that is a threat to the international rules-based order. We see that in the way that it has flagrantly and repeatedly breached the Sino-British Joint Declaration in Hong Kong by totally breaking its promises to the people of Hong Kong and destroying Hong Kong's freedoms. So if you look at its own actions and its own words, this is a regime that, whether we call it a foe is, I think, debatable, but certainly presents a challenge and has declared itself in terms of values and ideology an opponent of our values.
And Cindy, your thoughts? China, friend, foe, challenge, opportunity?
Well, I think it's certainly a challenge and an opportunity. And I think any state that rises up to challenge the Western-led world order that's established in the last few hundred years will always have been a challenge and an opportunity. In some areas, it's more challenging and perhaps more nearing it to be enemy status, and in others, it will be more friend. So I think it's a complicated picture. And just to go back to something that Benedict was saying, about the Chinese Communist Party setting itself as an ideological competitor. Yeah, of course. I mean, it has never tried to make a secret of that. But the question is, does it try to make the rest of us like it? And I haven't seen that. So it tries to trade with the rest of the world, and you can argue that it's exporting its high-tech surveillance equipment to all sorts of unsavory regimes across the world. But is it actually trying in a crusading way to make other people in its own image? And so does that ideology stay within its own borders, or is it actually a crusading thing? Well, actually, someone who's grew up in China and learned both Western and Eastern political philosophies, it actually seems that the crusading spirit is more a Western thing. We've always wanted to spread Christianity across the world, and now we want to spread liberalism and human rights, and that is a cause of a lot of pain, I think, in the last 20th century for a lot of people around the world. So I think the idea that China is trying to make everyone else like it is actually a reflection of what the West tries to do unwittingly and with the best of intentions sometimes around the world. So I don't know if it's necessarily a problem in and of itself for China to have a different ideology. People are different. This is a big world. There should be plurality of thought, but the question is, does it try to encroach on our freedoms? And that's where I think the red line should be drawn.
Great. And Richard, I'll leave the last word with you. China, friend or foe, or something else?
Thanks, Nikita. I mean, I think Cindy hit on a very important point there. We in the West have a sort of crisis in our relationship with China. And the word for crisis in Chinese is danger or opportunity. So we can make that crisis into something positive if we really work at it, or we can allow it to get worse and relationships to spiral down. But there is nothing, sorry about the bells in Parliament. Do you want me to pause for a moment?
We can hear you.
Or you can still hear me? But, you know, there's nothing inevitable about the direction of travel. Things don't have to get worse. We can engage, we can find good ways of realizing the opportunities and working together on incredibly important issues. And we can also differ and point out our differences in a way that is rational and sticks up for our values without insulting different ways of ruling countries. And that's the crucial thing, because ultimately, the West's attempt to try and make the rest of the world in our own image, I think, is almost doomed to trouble. We've seen that with the Arab Spring. We've seen the attempts to try and create liberal democracies in countries where that's not part of their DNA. And we need to focus more on getting our own ship in good order, so that the reasons why countries might want to become more like us are self-evident, because we're succeeding and because we are friendly and open and we welcome great relationships with great countries all around the world. That is ultimately what, in my belief, what will attract more of the thinking middle class in China to believe that a system of oppression and closing down debate, what the famous Wuhan doctor once called, you know, there has to be another voice, actually is not where China wants to be in the long term. There are many different opinions, many different views on so many different issues, but it's not for us to dictate that. That's for China to find her own way. What we can do is to influence strongly our relationships with her and her role in the global world, bringing her more strongly into the systems and institutions and the rule of law that we have, in a way that is not, if you like, discriminating against her, but is providing her with the opportunities that the world's joint #1 superpower undoubtedly requires in the modern age. So China is both an opportunity, a threat, a competitor. It's a complex relationship, rather like many of those we all have at home and in our working lives. Let's try and make the best of it rather than the worst of it. Thanks.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Benedict, Cindy, and Richard, for your comments today on our BBTV, China, Friend or Foe. Not a very easy question to answer, and much more complex than that. So I think we've touched on many different aspects of our relationship, and we were very, very happy that you could all join us today. And thank you.
Thank you very much.